I'm gonna find. And I'm gonna kill every last one of them.
The Last of Us Part 2 received unprecedented backlash leading up to and following its release in June of 2020. While the game is not in the top 10 of the all-time PS4 game sales lists, sitting around 10 million copies sold as of September of 2020, which is still a ton of copies, the amount of discussion of the game, much of it toxic, and leading to an arguable unfair Metacritic user score of 5.7 as of writing this, is unproportionate to these sales. The game is sitting at over 160,000 user reviews. For comparison, Uncharted 4 has sales of 15 million copies, which is almost 5 million more than The Last of Us Part 2, and a user rating a full 3 points higher on Metacritic. Yet the discourse surrounding The Last of Us Part 2 has an unprecedented number of people wanting to give their opinion on the game at almost 144,000 more reviews than Uncharted 4's 16,000 user reviews, despite the discrepancy in sales of Uncharted 4 to The Last of Us Part 2. Many of these large number of reviews on The Last of Us Part 2 happen to be negative opinions. To me, this shows just how important the story of this game is and how important it is that we try to digest what the game is telling us, good, bad, or indifferent, which I believe many of these user reviews failed to attempt. Some of the criticisms of the game are certainly understandable, if not warranted. The misleading marketing, where Joel was made out to look like a main protagonist throughout the game, rather than the haunting memory he became. The point of which, as I understand it, was to allow the player to have the proverbial rug pulled from under them, as Ellie did upon his death scene. Which worked for me, but I understand the frustration here. Joel is awesome, so who wouldn't want to keep playing as him in the game? We love him in a way. Another example is the 180 flip of the story to playing as Abby right at the game's climax, resulting in a runtime, making the game drag quite a bit. Plus, it is difficult to play as someone we don't like. We want to be able to relate to the characters we are playing as, and no one likes to have to relate to their enemies. It's difficult and uncomfortable. Meanwhile, other criticisms were unfounded. For example, the supposed diversity and LGBTQ agenda attacks. The people who never played the game and just assumed the game sucking was a fact, and the embarrassing death threats that followed, to name the most egregious. Go to Metacritic, sort by date, and look at how quickly some people somehow arrived at their quote-unquote critical opinions of this game. While these criticisms were often black and white, other criticisms were hitting on aspects that should have been treated as gray, but were not. They were also treated as black and white, right or wrong. These criticisms mostly revolved around the story of the game. The criticism I want to discuss specifically throughout the rest of this video is the believability of Ellie's quote-unquote revenge story. Ellie's story throughout this game should not be boiled down to something as simple as, quote, Ellie gets revenge and the cycle of violence, unquote. This game and its themes are too complex to be simplified and looked at in this way. So I'm going to offer a different perspective, emphasis on perspective. This is my interpretation of the game. I understand most of you have a completely different life experience than I do. The mere fact that everyone can take something different from this game is a testament to the depth of the characters in the world that Naughty Dog created. If your perspective was formed without having played the game, or you never tried to take something meaningful away from it, then this video is not made for you. But feel free to listen, but please try to use an open mind. I always related to Ellie, more so than Joel in these games, including The Last of Us Part 1, and I think that is somewhat out of the norm. Even in Part 1, when Joel was the hero, or anti-hero, depending on who you ask, and I was playing as him, I still related more to Ellie. I'm not saying I like Ellie more than Joel, which I think is not as uncommon a feeling, because she is hilarious throughout the entirety of The Last of Us Part 1, but I related more with her than the main protagonist. Only recently did I realize why I found her so relatable despite our obvious differences. For example, she's 10 years younger than me, female, etc. I relate to Ellie because addicts recognize addicts. While I am not a medical or mental health professional, so please seek out the help of a professional if you are struggling with addiction, I am a person who has lived Ellie's story firsthand. Not a story of violent revenge, but a story of addiction, and I am not alone.
I'll walk through the
According to the National Institute of Health, 10% of US adults, 10%, over 23 million people, have a drug use disorder at some point in their lives. Over 75% of these people never receive any form of treatment. My intention with this project is not to diagnose anyone or provide professional advice, but rather to simply share my interpretation of this aspect of the game's story of addiction in hopes that someone else out there finds it as helpful as I have.
Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell on this earth forever.
Addiction is baffling. I can't wrap my mind around it, even having lived through it firsthand. My goal here is to provide a different perspective that will maybe challenge the thinking of some of these criticisms about the game's story, a story of revenge, and help to bring further awareness, not to the cycle of violence, but to the cycle of addiction, and some of the challenges people face in overcoming this disease. I played The Last of Us Part 2 within the first week of release, which was the week of June 19th, 2020. For context, 9 months earlier, my best friend suffered a traumatic brain injury, and my relationship with him would never be the same again. It still isn't. Because the friend I knew had changed in many ways. He had changed prior to the injury, but this really opened my eyes to just how much. The head injury made me have feelings of guilt for what our relationship had become. Just like Ellie losing Joel and remembering the weeks and months she wasted in their relationship prior to his death. Ironically, also due to blunt force trauma to the head. This happened to coincide with me quitting my career to pursue a new passion in a different field, the pursuit of which was literally shut down by COVID-19 restrictions, making it so I could not take any steps towards my new goal. So my entire purpose and self-identity happened to be turned on its head. By the time the game released, I was abusing alcohol without realizing what had happened. The days spent playing this game, engrossed by the story, but not realizing it was talking directly to me at the time, were probably the only days I was sober for a 2-year period, beginning around the time of COVID and ending 2 years later. Many people noted the surface level resemblance to the real world at the time of the game's release. The existence of COVID made the world feel as if the infected in The Last of Us were all too real of a possibility. But less obvious was the addiction in the world of The Last of Us that mirrored the real world. During COVID, documented substance use increased according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention as of June 2020, the time of the game's release, 13%. 13% increase in documented substance use. This was done as a way for people to cope with stress or emotions related to COVID-19. The early months of the pandemic brought an 18% increase nationwide in overdoses compared to those same months in 2019. The trend continued throughout 2020. According to the American Medical Association, which reported in December that more than 40 US states had seen increases in opioid-related mortality, along with ongoing concerns for those with substance use disorders. Using data from a national survey of US adults on their drinking habits, they found that excessive drinking, such as binge drinking, increased by 21% during the COVID-19 pandemic. In the world of The Last of Us, basic resources are hard to come by. Thus, access to drugs and alcohol is scarce to none. The addictions of our modern world were not at their disposal. As such, we see the people of the world of The Last of Us turning to less obvious mind-altering drugs, revenge, anger, and violence. Ellie's story is not as black and white as many critics paint it to be. Her story of revenge, the action of inflicting hurt or harm on someone for an injury or wrong suffered at their hands, isn't as simple as it seems if we look at it through the lens, not of revenge, but the lens of addiction.
Another way to look at Joel, Ellie, and Abby as these three characters and their arcs is they're all struggling with quieting their demons.
What follows is a brief case for Ellie being addicted to revenge and how that relates to substance addiction. In a study published by Kimmel and Rowe, it is stated that data from multiple sources point to the desire for revenge in response to grievances or perceived injustices as a root cause of violence, including firearm violence. Neuroscience and behavioral studies are beginning to reveal that the desire for revenge in response to grievances activates the same neural rewarding processing circuitry as that of substance addiction, suggesting that grievances trigger powerful cravings for revenge in anticipation of experiencing pleasure. Based on this evidence, the authors argue that a behavioral addiction framework may be appropriate for understanding and addressing violent behavior. Furthermore, those addicted to anger are frequently obsessed with feelings of resentment and revenge.
Me, what became more and more clear is that obsession will cost you everything. If they would just be able to let it go, and they could potentially live better lives. But it's so systemic and endemic to who they are that they can't.
The irresistible rush of anger is often followed by acting out violently. Obsessing over the wrongs done by others often leads to anger or rage, whereby anger then controls our thoughts. People raised in the chaotic environment of uncertainty and volatility can become perversely comforted by the distraction of anger. Aside from traumatic family environments, also at risk are combat veterans, as they are in high-threat situations for long periods of time. Swiss researchers wanted to know what happens in the brain when someone reaps revenge. The researchers gave the wrong participant a chance to punish the other person, and for a full minute, as the victims contemplated revenge, the activity in their brain was recorded. Immediately, researchers noticed a rush of neural activity in the part of the brain known to process rewards. Revenge, in the moment, is quite rewarding. We often believe that exacting revenge is a form of emotional release and that getting retribution will help us feel better. Movies often portray the act of revenge as a way of gaining closure after a wrong. But in fact, revenge has the opposite effect. Even though the first few moments feel rewarding in the brain, psychological scientists have found that instead of quenching hostility, revenge prolongs the unpleasantness of the original offense. Instead of delivering justice, revenge often creates only a cycle of retaliation. In yet another study, authors Sussman and Sussman from 2011 conducted a literature search to determine the definition of addiction, landing on and further defining 5 common elements. Element 1 is a feeling of being different. 2 is a preoccupation with the behavior. 3, temporary satiation. 4, loss of control. And 5, negative consequences. Now, tying all of this back to The Last of Us Part 2 and Ellie's story to make my case for addiction being the main theme of this story. Element 1 of feeling different. Ellie has always felt different because in this world she is different. She's walking around with the knowledge that she is immune to the infection that everyone else is so worried about. This walking around the world knowing, and therefore feeling, she is different than everyone else is a common and leading factor that results in addiction. In my case, I have always had extreme social anxiety and never really felt I fit in anywhere, despite having many close relationships. It is simply a feeling of being different, even if you are not. Item 2 is a preoccupation with the behavior. The behavior, in this case, is revenge. Ellie's every decision is based around her ability to get revenge for the death of Joel. She cannot think of hardly anything else, much in the same way a substance addict can only think of getting their next drink, their next fix. If someone made a game about alcoholism, the criticism is not likely to be that the game is about alcohol. In the same way, revenge is the object in this game. The theme or the story of the game would be alcohol addiction. Not alcohol, but alcohol addiction. And therefore, this game shouldn't be looked at as being about revenge, but rather about revenge addiction. The third element is temporary satiation. In other words, there's a brief period when the person suffering from addiction is no longer obsessed with the subject of their addiction. They are no longer preoccupied with the behavior. The Last of Us blatantly and intentionally shows us this element in the farm scene prior to Ellie heading back out to California. I too had moments when I briefly found passions outside of my addiction. Playing this game, for example, provided a satiation for a week, but the addiction is not gone and it will return as bad as ever when a trigger arises, such as the memory of Joel that Ellie experiences in the barn.
Okay?
Sorry. I don't know what. I was just bringing in the. It's okay. Here we go. That's okay. Hey. Oh, man. It's good. Haven't had any excitement in a while.
Element 4 is the loss of control. Ellie heads to California and abandons everything good remaining in her life. Not because she wants to, but because she has lost control. The addiction is now in control of her choices. Dr. Nora Volkow, director of NIDA, states addiction as a disease impairs the free will and decision-making abilities of those affected. Denial is the conclusion that the object of addiction is not a problem, and it keeps addicts trapped and without control. Both ignorance and the inability to self-examine oneself work together to keep addicts stuck in the addiction. I personally lost several friends and almost my wife due to my addiction. Not because I preferred alcohol to them or because I wanted to hurt them in any way, but because I had lost the ability to think for myself or was unwilling or unable to truly self-reflect. While I felt in total control in the moment, I looked back and realized my entire thinking had been changed. I was clearly no longer in control. I clearly was no longer me. The fifth and final element that defines addiction is negative consequences. Ellie's story culminates in the lasting mark of these negative consequences through losing Dina and JJ, Dina's son, and losing parts of herself, shown quite literally in the final scene with the missing fingers as she tries to strum the guitar. This phase often leads to what is called hitting rock bottom. Only when the addicted person can perceive they have hit rock bottom, which often happens more than once, the bottom just keeps getting deeper and deeper every time someone hits it until the person truly finds the bottom.
I can't. Hey, stop. Hey, come on. We've got a family. She doesn't get to be more important than that.
Girl, this boat is sinking. There's no sea left for me. And how the sky gets heavy when you are underneath it. Oh, I want to sail away from here.
I'm not gonna do this again.
That's up to you.
There is like we Ashley and I and other people on the team, we talked a lot about Ellie's obsession with Abby is a lot like a drug addict. And Dina leaves because she sees a drug addict that just can't quit. Like no matter, every time Dina thinks she hit bottom, it's like she hasn't hit bottom. It doesn't look like she's going to hit bottom anytime soon.
Many who have addictions are extremely stubborn, as Ellie has always been throughout the story of The Last of Us and The Last of Us Part 2, and as I too have always been. Based on this 5-pillar framework, the case can be made that Ellie's craving for revenge can clearly be defined as an addiction. In Forbes.com's review of the game, I happen to reference this review quite a few times throughout this critique. I'm not trying to attack the reviewer. It simply did a good job of collecting a lot of the criticisms of the game all in one review. So per the Forbes review, quote, Ellie's death is much more tragic because the game proceeds to ruin her character in every subsequent scene, thoroughly destroying any semblance of who she once was and turning her into a relentlessly selfish, murderous jerk. All because somebody thought that a story about a cycle of revenge would be more interesting than a story about wandering through an abandoned museum. I bring that up because to me, the museum bit was the most powerful piece of storytelling in the entire game. In a flashback, Joel takes Ellie to a surprise. She tries to guess what it is along the way, and the two banter back and forth like the good old days. The surprise is an abandoned museum. The first thing you see is a giant T-Rex outside its doors. And if you're the exploring type, you discover that you can climb up its back and leap off its head into the pool below. Maybe you do this 2 or 3 times just because it's so light and breezy and you desperately need a break from grim and awful. It's such a cool bit of storytelling. It's so at odds with the rest of the game. It's imaginative and beautiful. The sequence takes a dark turn in the end, and that juxtaposition of whimsy and terror makes it by far my favorite part of the game. Joel and Ellie are still a team. They have some great bonding moments. There's some laughs, a good scary bit, and it's done. I wish the entire game had been like this. Moments of beauty and moments of ugliness woven together in a kind of bleak harmony. Some contrast, some variety. Instead, it's a game about 2 young women trying to kill one another, while everyone around them also tries to kill each other. You stab and or break so many necks by the time it's over, you start to feel a bit numb. It's a game about hate, and don't you dare forget it. End quote. Sadly, I agree with a lot of the reviewer's statements here. I look at Ellie, and I too hate the person she has turned into in her relentless pursuit of revenge. I hate it even more because I can see my own reflection in her story. This is the stigma that exists with addiction, and the shame that a person feels if a person is lucky enough to recover, as I have and currently am. See Ellie at the end of the game, for example, in the farmhouse when she can't even look at herself in the mirror. I too got to a point when I refused to look at my own reflection.
The Last of Us holds up a mirror to that and says, are you willing to hate the thing you love? And not only will you love it, will you selflessly love it? Don't love this thing selfishly for what you want it to be, but can you love it for what it is?
The reviewer stated, quote, I used to like Ellie quite a bit, but not by the time I finished this game, end quote. Trust me, Ellie didn't like herself by the end of this game either. That's exactly the point. The game got us to feel the way the character does by game's end. This sentiment of disliking someone suffering from addiction is not uncommon. The Associated Press, NORC, Center for Public Affairs Research, found more than half of people polled, around 53%, view prescription drug addiction as, quote, a disease. But only 20% of these people who view it as a disease would closely associate with someone suffering from addiction. Addiction is tragic. Addiction does destroy any semblance of who a person once was, as it did to Ellie. It turns them into a relentlessly selfish jerk, as the reviewer states. It does, just as the reviewer commented. Even in recovery, I don't blame people who think of me as a selfish jerk for the way that I was during my addiction. I too hate who I was. It was not who I considered myself to be in any way. I acted in a way that was against everything I stand for. I used to think of myself as having principles as strong as Steve Rogers, but I now find myself relating more to Tony Stark. Prior to my addiction, I volunteered with young at-risk children. I took my grandparents to haircuts. I did anything that was asked of me, or even not asked of me, for someone else. Now, I found myself being selfish and doing whatever pleased me with no concern for others. Many who argue against addiction being a disease do so because they believe classifying addiction as a disease takes away all personal responsibility for the addict's actions. Some people think addiction cannot be a disease because it is caused by the individual's choice to use substances. While the first use, or early stage use, may be by choice, once the brain has been changed by addiction, most experts believe that the person loses control of their behavior. Choice does not determine whether something is a disease. Heart disease, diabetes, and some forms of cancer all involve personal choices like diet, exercise, sun exposure, etc. A disease is what happens in the body as a result of those choices. Personally, I believe addiction is a disease, and at the same time, I have great regret and shame for the decisions I made while suffering from the disease. I was sick, and I also made terrible decisions during my sickness. I must take ownership of that. But I did not choose to be an addict. Just as someone with diabetes doesn't choose to have diabetes. My choice began with choosing to not address the disease in the way I should have. And this is not uncommon. That is where I believe the difference is. Addiction is a disease that makes you resist receiving treatment. You are forced to make that choice to get treatment, and your brain fights with everything it can to convince you not to get it. Diabetes, and most other diseases, have treatments people are not ashamed to seek and use. In fact, the brain screams for the person to go get the treatment, whereas for addiction, it screams the opposite. This makes receiving treatment almost out of the question for those suffering from addiction. In the post-apocalyptic world of The Last of Us Part 2, seeking help is even more difficult, if not impossible, for Ellie to find, let alone seek out. So, the addiction, in this case revenge, is bound to win 99% of the time. Where I begin to vehemently disagree with the Forbes review statement is when the criticism becomes that the writers thought the story about revenge would be more entertaining than a story about love. Personally, I believe the writers didn't think a dark and disturbing story about a young girl's addiction to revenge would be more entertaining. They thought it would be more important.
And they said, wow, I didn't think like anything could top the first game, but this feels like such an important story to tell.
If you want a game that is made to entertain you, play the Uncharted series. Naughty Dog is arguably among the best developers at making games to entertain its audience. They can seemingly do it at the snap of their fingers, as seen with the simple museum sequence in this game. Uncharted 4 was meant to entertain you, and the sales numbers prove that, sitting around 15 million copies sold, with revenues grossing over $1 billion. I don't believe the developers made this game planning on it selling more than Uncharted 4. While yes, the gameplay of this game should be rewarding, because it is a game after all, the story is not trying to necessarily entertain you. The story is trying to challenge the player, an important task more games need to continue pursuing. Only 21% of gamers are under 18 years old, with the average gamer age being 34 years of age. As such, this is meant to be a mature story to be digested by mature adults. The core audience is not intended to be high school or grade school children. The audience is meant to be adults who can digest the story and find the meaning, whether they like the story or not. I am an avid reader of military nonfiction. I hate the stories that are being told. They are tragic, violent, and devastating. Nonetheless, those stories are important for exactly that reason. We need to be challenged to understand the world is not always sunshine and rainbows. Many people use games as an escape of the bleakness of the real world, and that is understandable and important as well. But the writers did not make a game about the end of humanity and the darkest parts of human nature to let the player escape into happiness and bliss. Data suggests gaming has an unprecedented opportunity to increase the empathy of participants in their stories, as it is a rare medium form in that you literally walk in the shoes of a character and make gameplay decisions with some element of control. This does not mean story decisions. Those are intentionally not always in the player's control. The only way to build empathy is to undertake challenging experiences which push you outside your comfort zone. It is important that the industry has leaders with the ability and the audacity to take up this task of challenging their audience to play from a perspective they seemingly cannot or will not understand. The echo chamber that can be found in society today makes it so people can live in a bubble where their viewpoint is the only viewpoint they consume. The fan service of Marvel's recent movies is a prime example of this. The studio is outrageously successful when it gives the audience exactly what the audience wants and entertains them from start to finish. This isn't a criticism of Marvel necessarily. They make my favorite movies, in fact, but it is important to also have media that is challenging the audience. To sacrifice the guaranteed financial success of giving the audience exactly what they wanted in this game to tell an important and challenging story says a lot about the developer in my eyes. This game is not subverting the players' expectations just because they want to make their fans mad, though I'm sure they knew fans might be angry. The game is subverting audience expectations because that is what it is to live the human experience. Rarely do people do exactly what we want. Sometimes, in fact, they do what we hate. And we must choose to love them anyway, or find ourselves being miserable all the time. Naughty Dog, thank you for not making the story I wanted, but the story I needed to hear, though it took me almost 2 years to understand what you were trying to tell me. Referring again back to the Forbes review, the museum scene is indeed beautiful. Unfortunately, beautiful scenes are hard to see when a person is in the grasp of addiction. Even while they are happening, many of the scenes with Dina and JJ, with Jesse and Tommy, with Joel, were beautiful if you look at them with love. I look back at my wife talking to me during my times being miserable, during my addiction, having very difficult conversations for both of us. While they were uncomfortable and unbearable at the time, I hated them. They now are beautiful moments when I look back. Dreadful and shameful, yes, but at the same time, beautiful. We didn't have to be at a cool museum or doing something fun for the beauty to exist. Her love shining through all of the hate that I was emitting due to my addiction was the beauty. Addiction is not a tale of hate, just as this game is not a tale of hate, as the reviewer stated. It's a tale of love, finding a way through the hate. No matter how the story ends, it is the tale of love shining down on hate, making it cower in shame, fear, and embarrassment, as Ellie does at game's end. Love doesn't always win, but it never stops shining. The Last of Us Part 2 is in fact a game about love.
You know, when we first started talking about this game, I said, the first game's about love, this game's about hate. That's not true. Both games are about love. And both games explore the most wonderful things love can provide, like when you see Ellie and Joel in the space capsule and how much these two characters are willing to do for each other in these really sweet moments, and the worst things that love can drive you to, and that's like Ellie's journey throughout the whole game. It's just her ego is so wrapped up in bringing these people to justice, and it takes her hitting complete rock bottom for her to finally wake up.
Ellie's story is a tragic, a mind-boggling, a dark, yet hopeful, if you have the courage to look for the hope, tale about the disease of addiction. While yes, the object of her addiction is revenge, the causes, characteristics, and recovery process is in line with the stereotypical addictions of drugs, alcohol, pornography, etc. that plague today's society, that haunted me for the darkest 2 years of my life. According to Forbes, Ellie gives up her nice little life and sets off again to try to kill Abby again. Because Ellie learns nothing in this game. She must have left behind 200 corpses in Seattle, including all of Abby's friends, but that's not enough to sate her thirst for comeuppance, and she doesn't realize, bafflingly, that it will never be enough. Revenge won't bring Joel back, and it won't assuage her guilt at how she treated him, and it won't lead to a life of happiness. But off she goes to California. In my personal story, the word revenge could be replaced with the word alcohol almost seamlessly in this Forbes statement. Alcohol in the moment was quite rewarding, as is killing those who have slighted Ellie or stand in her way. And alcohol did make me feel better for a time, as it does for Ellie, who likely gets a release of adrenaline and therefore relief every time she kills in the name of her twisted justice. Resentment will do that. By the end of the 2 years I spent making myself quote-unquote feel better via alcohol, I was absolutely miserable, full of hate, and even alcohol no longer provided that rewarding feeling. I was aware alcohol was no longer providing any kind of benefit to me whatsoever, but I kept using it regardless, bafflingly. Just as Ellie becomes a mess towards the end of the game, but she too can't stop. She keeps pushing down her path of destruction. I cannot explain why I kept using, other than referring back to the framework where we stated that those suffering from addiction at some point lose control. I too hated every sip, but I kept turning to it. The reviewer is spot on. Addiction is baffling. It is also cunning and powerful indeed. And one final look at the Forbes review. What this game needed in the end was grace. The kind of strange, unsettling thing that comes over someone when they suddenly realize something profound and choose to take a different path. When Ellie sees her emaciated enemy hanging from a pole, and instead of feeling gleeful satisfaction, feels only horror and pity, she acted with grace and mercy, and in that moment, became the person we hoped she would become. It was never about killing Abby, it was about Ellie finding her own redemption, and then they throw it all away. Two angry, beat up, half dead murderesses slicing each other over and over again in the shallows, blood and salt water spraying everywhere until suddenly, Ellie gives up and lets Abby go. Again. And I'm not one to usually criticize games for their violence, but this felt exploitive to me, and redundant. All the potential for mercy and grace lost. Ellie already let her go. She had already come to the conclusion that she should let Abby live when she cut her down. Why go through all that again? Why have this horrible, violent, senseless slasher fight if, at its conclusion, Ellie simply lets Abby go again? The ending could have worked with mercy or revenge as the outcome, but apparently the writers had trouble making up their minds about which direction they wanted to go and decided to try and have their cake and eat it too. The result feels sloppy, repetitive, and frustrating. More than anything, this game's ending needed to not beat around the bush. The last scene, when Ellie returns home to an empty farmhouse, Dina and her baby long gone, is better. A fitting reward for Ellie's selfish, self-destructive obsession with revenge. A game about hate, sure, but even more, a game about loss. End of Forbes review. Any addiction sufferer understands exactly what Ellie went through when she cut down Abby, only to go back to revenge almost immediately before finally letting grace win, as the reviewer suggests. Almost every single morning during my addiction, I would wake up seeing the flaws in my decisions of the day before. But without even making the cognizant decision, I found myself back on my couch with a full stock of fresh alcohol. This process happened so many times. At least 5 different major rock bottoms came and went, along with the grace I found following each one, before that one time when it finally stuck and I let my addiction to alcohol go. Just as Ellie finally lets her addiction to revenge go, as she allows Abby to get back in her boat.
And finally, like for Ellie, like she keeps a bit of her humanity. She lets go of that addiction at a great cost, but she still maintains the goodness that exists within her.
Just take him.
I struggle with understanding if I was truly making a choice to keep drinking or not. But with how miserable I was and how out of character I was acting, I truly don't know how I possibly could have kept making that same choice over and over, even after seemingly finding clarity. Addiction is powerful, and it holds on to you with all of its might, just as it did Ellie, until the end. Regarding the farmhouse, I sadly agree that the ending with Dina and JJ being gone when she returns home from her addiction is fitting. And very commonly, what addiction sufferers find in their lives when they finally find that lasting grace and peace and let the addiction in the past. Those living with an addict have no choice. They must look out for themselves and others in the situation that can't look out for themselves. At some point, a line in the sand must be drawn. I was lucky in that my wife drawing this line in the sand and saying enough is enough truly was my final rock bottom. I woke up once and for all, found grace, and found peace. Unfortunately, there was still a lot that I had lost when I found myself again. A lot lost that I would never get back. The hardest and first step in the treatment of any addiction is admitting the problem exists. It takes maturity and guts to admit your addiction has become a problem. My interpretation of the ending is that Ellie finally admits she has become addicted to revenge and is willing to end the cycle of addiction. Walking away from the guitar at the end, after looking at her missing fingers and being self-aware of what addiction has done to her life, the life that Joel saved, Ellie finally can walk away and begin the recovery process. Humor, exercise, mindfulness, and meditation are all tools at Ellie's disposal. Some of them she's used quite successfully prior to losing herself to the addiction, specifically humor. The resentment is gone. She has found some inner peace and is ready to move on, to continue living. Whether her family and Dina and JJ will take her back after the pain she has caused them is unknown. Only time will tell. But regardless, Ellie is finally free. She can finally move forward and stop looking back with hate. She can reclaim the self-love she has been lacking for the duration of the game. This is a game about hate and loss, sure, but even more, a game about love. For those of you who know someone suffering from addiction, thank you for shining your light of love on them. Thank you for being gentle but strong. Thank you for showing your love even if they cannot see it as love in the moment, like Dina did when she left. Though they maybe can't let your love bring them out of the darkness just yet, hopefully they will find their way to the help they need, and when they crawl their way out of that darkness, they will remember seeing your light down there in the dark, and it will mean the world to them. For those of you who may be suffering from addiction, you are not alone. You may not be able to see it right now, but the world is beautiful, and you will be able to see that again if you keep fighting to find peace and self-love. No matter how ugly the media and life circumstances make it seem, the world is still beautiful if you frame it right. I don't know what you are going through in life. I'm sure it is worse than anything I've ever experienced in my privileged life. But I know the suffocating nature of addiction. I know how baffling it is to you and how frustrating it is not to be able to do anything about it just yet. I know you probably want out, and you need out. Seek help, seek it any way you can. Keep fighting. Keep breathing. One day, you will find yourself again, and you will be able to walk away. Free again to live your life not in peace, but with peace. Just keep breathing. You are not alone. Ellie was not the last of us. There are millions more of us than you realize.
It's no better to be safe than sorry. Take on me. Take me on. I'll be gone in a day or two. In a day or two. All right, we should keep moving.
Yeah.
Well, I came upon a man at the top of a hill, called himself the savior of the human race, said he'd come to save the world from destruction and pain. But I said, how can you save the world from itself? Cause I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and I fear no evil because I'm blind. Oh, and I walk beside the still waters, and they restore my soul. But I know when I die, my soul is dead.
One trip and you're back that way. I don't recognize these eyes. I don't recognize these hands. Please believe me when I tell you that this is not who I am. If I recover, will you take me back again? Just another trying hard to fit right in, but the photographs remind me of who I used to be. If only I could go back where I was me. I'll try hard to make this right. I'll try hard to win this fight. One step at a time, they say. One trip and you're back that way. I don't recognize these eyes. I don't recognize these hands. Please believe me when I tell you that this is not who I am. If I recover, will you take me back again? Just another trying hard to fit right in, but the photographs remind me of who I used to be. If only